The air hung heavy with salt and humidity over Truk Lagoon. The sun had already begun to fall toward the horizon, staining the calm Pacific waters with streaks of orange and crimson. Anchored in the lagoon's still embrace lay the Shōkaku, once one of Japan's most powerful aircraft carriers, pride of the Imperial Navy. Now she sat quietly, her flight deck barren, her hangars silent, her engines dormant. The smell of oil, rust, and cigarette smoke lingered like ghosts of the great battles past. Below decks, in a cramped steel-walled conference room, 5 officers of the Imperial Japanese Navy sat in silence. Maps sprawled across the table. An ashtray overflowed. For 3 hours they had argued, quietly, bitterly, hopelessly. Now for 10 long minutes, not one man spoke. Finally, Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, the most respected voice among them, broke the silence. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice steady but tired, "we must acknowledge what these numbers are telling us. The war is lost." No one contradicted him. No one had to. Each man stared down at the maps, the Pacific Ocean stretching wide and merciless before them, and silently knew the truth. It was August 6, 1942, exactly 2 months since the Battle of Midway. The disaster of that engagement had stunned the Imperial Navy, but the full implications were only now sinking in. Japan had not merely lost 4 carriers at Midway. It had lost the initiative, perhaps forever. To understand how these admirals reached this grim realization, we must go back 8 months earlier to December 7, 1941, the day that changed the world. That morning, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's grand design unfolded with near-perfect execution. 6 Japanese carriers had sailed undetected across the Pacific and launched over 350 aircraft toward Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. In less than 2 hours, the American Pacific Fleet was shattered. 8 battleships sunk or damaged, nearly 200 aircraft destroyed, over 2,400 Americans dead. It was a stunning tactical triumph, one of the most perfectly coordinated air-sea operations in naval history. Japan rejoiced. The United States reeled. In Tokyo, bells rang and officials toasted what they called the dawn of a new era. But not everyone celebrated. In private, Yamamoto, the architect of the attack, was subdued. He reportedly told a colleague, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." Whether he truly said those exact words remains debated, but his fear was real. He knew the United States was a giant, one whose strength, once roused, could not be matched. The Japanese high command, intoxicated by victory, failed to grasp the deeper consequences. Pearl Harbor had succeeded tactically, but strategically, it had doomed Japan. The Americans' aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, had been at sea and thus untouched. The massive fuel depots at Pearl Harbor, containing millions of gallons of oil, had been left intact. So too had the submarine base and repair yards, the very facilities that would allow the U.S. Navy to recover and strike back with astonishing speed. Pearl Harbor had lit the fuse of a war Japan could not win. In early 1942, Japanese intelligence estimates were sobering even then. Analysts believed Japan had 6 to 8 months before American industry would begin to overwhelm them in production, training, and logistics. Yamamoto understood this window, and he gambled everything on exploiting it. In that short span, Japan had to cripple the U.S. Navy, seize vital resources across Southeast Asia, and build an impregnable defensive perimeter before American industry came fully online. But by August 1942, those 8 months were over. The window had closed. At Midway in June 1942, Yamamoto launched his boldest gamble. He hoped to lure the remaining American carriers into a trap and annihilate them in one decisive stroke. The classic doctrine of Kantai Kasen, or decisive battle, that had defined Japanese naval strategy for decades. Instead, it was Japan that was ambushed. Thanks to brilliant American code-breaking, Admiral Chester Nimitz knew exactly where and when Japan would strike. In a few fateful minutes on June 4th, American dive bombers found the Japanese fleet, and in a single fiery hour, 4 of Japan's elite carriers were lost: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Their destruction wasn't merely a loss of hardware. They took with them hundreds of Japan's finest pilots, men whose skills could never be replaced. Japan had begun the war with 10 fleet carriers. By August 1942, only 6 remained, and 2 of those were damaged. The US, meanwhile, was launching new carriers faster than Japan could replace her pilots. In the quiet of that August meeting aboard Shōkaku, the admirals studied intelligence reports that chilled them to the bone. American shipyards were building carriers at a pace no one in Tokyo had imagined possible. Over a dozen fleet carriers, larger and more powerful Essex-class ships, were already under construction. By early 1943, the first would join the fleet. By 1944, America would have numerical superiority so vast that Japan's defensive perimeter would be meaningless, and the carriers were only part of the story. In 1941, Japan had produced around 5,000 military aircraft. The United States had built 19,000 that same year, and that number was skyrocketing. By 1943, American factories were projected to build 85,000 aircraft annually. Japan, if everything went perfectly, might manage 16,000. The math was merciless. The war had become a contest of factories, and Japan was hopelessly outmatched. In the first 6 months of the war, Japan's armies had swept across Asia and the Pacific with breathtaking speed. The Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, Burma, dozens of islands from the Gilberts to the Solomons. It was the largest expansion of Japanese power in history, but it came at a cost. One the admirals now understood too well. The empire was too vast. Its defensive perimeter stretched thousands of miles, impossible to defend everywhere, impossible to supply everywhere. Japan had conquered too much too fast. The Americans could strike anywhere. Japan had to defend everywhere. That asymmetry alone meant eventual defeat. One officer hesitantly suggested the unthinkable. "Perhaps," he said, "we might sue for peace. Offer to return some territories. Spare our homeland the devastation that will surely come." The room fell silent again. Then came bitter laughter. They all knew what American public opinion was. They had read the intercepted analyses. After Pearl Harbor, there would be no negotiation, no compromise. The United States demanded unconditional surrender. The American people, once isolationist, were now united by rage and resolve. Factories ran around the clock. War bonds were oversubscribed. Women filled the assembly lines. The sleeping giant was fully awake. There would be no peace, not until Japan lay broken. As the meeting continued, the admirals turned to the question of why. Where had it all gone wrong? Admiral Kiichi Nagamo, commander of the Pearl Harbor Strike Force, spoke with quiet bitterness. The attack, he said, had been designed to destroy America's battleships, crippling U.S. naval power long enough for Japan to build an unassailable empire. The idea was that, after 6 months of humiliation, America would sue for peace. The theory was fatally flawed. The battleships had been rendered obsolete. The carriers were the real power, and they had survived. Worse, the attack had united America, not demoralized it. Pearl Harbor had given the United States the moral high ground. The late declaration of war made it appear as a sneak attack, a betrayal of diplomatic trust. American propaganda called it a day of infamy, and that label stuck. What was meant to be Japan's greatest triumph had become its greatest strategic blunder. Then came another blow, one far smaller militarily, but devastating psychologically. In April 1942, 16 American B-25 bombers launched from the carrier Hornet and bombed Tokyo and other cities. The damage was trivial, but the message was enormous. The Japanese public, told their homeland was untouchable, now watched bombs fall on their capital. panic spread. The army diverted aircraft and troops to defend the home islands, resources that should have gone to the front. Worse still, the raid spurred the high command to rush into the Midway operation, hoping to lure the U.S. carriers into destruction and restore national pride. Instead, it led directly to disaster. Midway also revealed another horrifying truth. Japanese codes were being read by the Americans. They didn't yet know how deeply their communications were compromised, but they suspected the worst. Every plan, every ship movement, every logistical order could be in American hands before it was even executed. A navy cannot fight effectively when the enemy knows its moves before it makes them. And that was exactly Japan's predicament. By the meeting's final hour, reality had settled like ash after a fire. Japan had attacked the United States to secure vital oil and resources. But even as its armies occupied the Dutch East Indies, the oil they captured could not save them. American submarines were choking the shipping lanes that brought that oil home. Without oil, ships could not sail. Planes could not fly. Training could not continue. Even with victory after victory, Japan's industry was too small, too brittle. Its population too limited. Its leadership too blind. The admirals knew it now. This was not a war Japan could win. It was a war Japan could only delay losing. In early August 1942, as the Shōkaku lay in Truk Lagoon, American Marines landed on Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. The Japanese rushed to respond. But to Yamaguchi and his peers, the pattern was clear. Guadalcanal was the start of a new kind of war, the American kind. Methodical, industrial, relentless. The Americans would seize an island, build an airfield, dominate the skies, then move on. Each victory would bring them closer to Japan's inner defenses. Each loss would bleed Japan's strength further. It was not glorious. It was not romantic. But it was inevitable. One final report was read aloud before the meeting ended. A forecast from the Ministry of Finance. It projected Japan's war economy through 1945 under various conditions. Every model told the same story. Collapse by late 1944. By then, the empire would be unable to sustain the military, unable even to feed its population. Japan had been at war for just 8 months, and already the countdown to defeat had begun. When the meeting finally adjourned, there were no formal conclusions, no bold declarations. The admirals knew what they could never say aloud. Japan had lost the war on December 7, 1941, the day it attacked Pearl Harbor. The victory that had electrified the empire had, in truth, sealed its fate. One by one, the officers rose, saluted, and left the smoke-filled room. They returned to their duties, planning operations they knew could not succeed, sending men to battles they knew could not be won. Outside, night fell over Truk Lagoon. The stars reflected on the water. The Shōkaku lay silent, her decks empty beneath the tropical moon. The war would rage for 3 more years. Millions more would die. Cities would burn. The empire would crumble. But in that dim room on August 6, 1942, 5 men had already seen the future, and it was written in the ink of their own reports, the ashes of their own triumphs. They knew the truth that Japan's leaders would not face for another 3 years. The empire had awakened a giant, and there would be no stopping it.